At least not here.
Yeah. Yeah, like we're just nice to form because also like campus, but there are just tell me there's
a hot ticket, like Hamilton in here.
I wish I I'll be so
You get a bigger vegetable.
Check, check, check. Check, check.
Hey everybody! Everybody, welcome, welcome. I think I know everyone. In case I don't, I'm Jay Sexton, director of the Kinder Institute here. We're now finishing our second week of the semester, but it never feels like the semester starts until we have our first seminar. So we've all been waiting for this. I'm really excited. We have our second visiting fellow of the year in a row giving us a lecture. We ended with Krista Dirkside at the end of last term, and we're starting with Lily Santoro this term. Carly Conklin is going to introduce, but before we do that, I just wanted to make sure everyone has seen our hot off the press seminar schedule for this term. It is hot. It is good. We got some good stuff in here. Brooke Blower in 2 weeks. I think Brooke Blower is one of the best in the business. She's just fantastic. We've got Santa Fe Trail Days. We're going to have mules on the quad in April 11th. Who wants to see some mules as part of the event? That's right. So we got that to look forward to. We have our former colleagues, Adam Seagrave, who probably all the students here wouldn't have been around when Adam was part of the Kinder Institute. I think he left in 2018, 19, something like that. He's coming back with Stephanie Schoeniken, who had been the chair of the Black Studies department here. They created a course called Race and the American Story. How many students have taken Race and the American Story? This class started with them. It's a legacy. It's a fantastic thing that they achieved, and they've now written a book called Race and the American Story, where they interweave their own personal biographies with the construction of this class and with this very important, big, central issue to American history. So that'll be another one to circle. Actually, circle them all. Come to all of these. We never have seats available. The football and basketball team wishes that we had the turnout that we have. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. Great way to start the semester off. Over to Carly Conklin. Welcome, Carly.
Everybody, we're super excited to have Dr. Lily Santoro giving our first lecture of the spring semester. Dr. Santoro is an associate professor of historic preservation and history at Southeast Missouri State University, where she teaches courses in early American history and in public history. She earned her PhD in American history from the University of Delaware and did her BA in history prior to that at University of Southern California. She holds a certificate in museum studies from University of Delaware and a certificate in digital archives and records management from San Jose State University. Her current research explores the discourse of popularized science and religion in mid-19th century African American newspapers. That will be the topic of her lecture today. In addition to maintaining an active research agenda and teaching agenda, Dr. Santoro is an active public historian. She's part of the Bollinger Center for Regional Histories project with Southeast Missouri State University, where she assists in training, consulting, and helping provide access to digital platforms for public institutions that are seeking to preserve their cultural heritage in digital form. In short, she helps small house museums throughout the state learn how to digitize their archives to make them accessible more broadly. We are absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Santoro here as a distinguished fellow at the Kinder Institute for the 2023-24 academic year, and thrilled to have her spearhead our series this semester with Science, Scripture, Reason, and Race, Discourses of Citizenship in the Mid-19th Century Black Press. Welcome, Dr. Santoro. Thank you.
Okay, can you all hear me now? Excellent. So I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today, and also for the opportunity to be a fellow here at Kinder. It has been a really awesome year so far. I've felt the love and all the support of so many cool scholars and wonderful students, and it has been a really fantastic opportunity. So thank you guys for having me. I want to talk I'm very excited to talk to you about what I have been working on here at Kinder this year. This project began with what I thought was a pretty small question. To what extent did African American newspapers engage with the idea of polygenesis in the 19th century? But as I have had more time and support and gotten to read a whole lot more newspapers, I found that my focus expanded a bit to examine the ways in which theological and scientific racism became part of the discourse of Black citizenship in the African American press in the 19th century. And today I am going to introduce some of what I have learned so far, and I'm looking forward to all your questions and comments at the end. I do have to be honest with you all, as I prepared this talk over the last few weeks, I wanted to tell you everything. I was so excited. I wanted to say everything that I've been learning about religion and science and uplift and politics and citizenship and all these things, and how they all played out in the pages of African American newspapers, and I had 1,000 quotes to share with you. Then at the beginning of this week, I realized that I had written basically the outline of an entire semester-long course, and that was not going to work. So today, I regrouped, and today I decided that my talk would do 3.5 things. And that is more than enough. So just to give us, this is to keep me on track. Our to-do list for today is we're going to start by talking a little bit about the historical context of citizenship and democracy and race in American political culture in the first half of the 19th century. Second, I'm going to talk about some of the themes that marked the discourses of citizenship in the Black press and in the years before the Civil War, with particular emphasis on religion and science. And then finally, we'll circle back to talk about some of the reasons why this matters. This is my half a thing. Because this project is still kind of at its halfway point, and I am still fleshing this out. But I have some ideas, and I'm looking forward to, at the end, there will be plenty of time for questions, comments, and enthusiastic and hopefully non-angry diatribes. So, but before I begin, before we get started, I have one more general thing I want to say about my talk and this topic. For those of you wondering, yes, I really did title this Discourses. I used the plural on purpose. Just like other communities in the 19th century, the African American community had multiple ways of talking about citizenship in the United States. There were multiple places for divergence of opinion and all-out disagreement within the Black community of activists and intellectuals. And the Black community, just like any other community, was not a monolith. And I really want to say that because I'm going to talk in some broad generalities today. But the fact is, I'm bringing this up because this has been a major area of focus among historians of Black intellectual and political history in recent years. And my work builds on and benefits greatly from the work of scholars like Van Goss, Christopher James Bonner, Patrick Real, Mia Bay, Britt Russert, and Rachel Walker, who have all explored some aspects of the competing and political and cultural views that Black activists in the 19th century had. Rather than assume a clear and shared agenda, these authors have pointed out that there were schisms, there were rifts, there were minor disagreements, there were some really great stories that didn't have room for about with different publishers of Black newspapers having serious beef with each other. But that basically, this is something I want you to know is also in the background of this story, but I'm not going to have as much time to sort of flesh out. But that was why I titled it that way. So this brings me to the question that we really need to start with, which is we need to talk about how citizenship and democracy and voting and all this stuff was sort of changing at the beginning of the 19th century. And so this is my part 1 of my to-do list for those of us keeping track. Historians often refer to the period between the 1820s and 1850s as a period of democratization. Sometimes we call it Jacksonian democracy because it sounds and powerful. This period is marked by, and I'm giving you like the intro to US history version of this. This period is marked by the expansion of suffrage as states discontinued property qualifications for voting, and second, an expansion of political involvement by the common man, whose participation in the process was encouraged by the organization of sort of modern-looking political parties and processes, and the beginnings of reform movements like those inspired by the Second Great Awakening to call for things like temperance, prison reform, the end of slavery. All of this is happening alongside the sort of culmination of gradual emancipation in the northern states. A process that began in the 1780s of states in the north, basically from Pennsylvania on up, passing gradual emancipation laws that said, we're ending slavery, but not today. And for example, in the case of New York, they passed this law, I think, in the 1780s, and they don't officially end slavery until 1827. So it's a slow process. But what you do see, right, is that now you've got a growing population of free Black people in the North as well, also in this moment of democratization. So let's talk a little bit about what Americans thought qualified one to be a citizen in the 19th century. And please excuse how rambly my bullet points are, but basically, white policymakers in this period believed, we're sort of building on an old expectation, right? That if you were going to vote, if you were going to have all the full rights of a citizen, you were supposed to be a property owner, right? But in this time period, we see the end of that. And so they start to have these debates about, well, what should you, how can you prove that you're a good citizen? How can you prove that you have the right and the capability of being that kind of responsible voter, citizen in America? And so they would say, well, you have to prove that you have, you've contributed, you have a stake in society. And this was often done through taxes, or if I'm a large property owner, a lot of taxes. But it could also be seen in things, in the discourse we see policymakers mentioning things like, well, you know, you also serve in the militia, or in New York, if you helped build the roads, you counted, you got the right to vote even if you didn't pay taxes. Or, you know, you pay taxes, maybe not a lot of taxes, but you're sort of in there. That all these things together demonstrated your responsibility and your stake in society, and so that made you a good candidate for citizenship. Also, you had to be a man, and then I could go down that road, but I'm not going to. And then you ideally had to demonstrate some level of personal independence, the idea being, and this was where the property ownership came from, right? That property owners don't rent from anybody. So when they go to vote, they don't have to worry about like they owe somebody their vote, or they have to vote the way their landlord says. This is the part that's wiggly, right, as we expand the right to vote in the early 19th century. And so more and more poor white Americans are like, well, I may be a wage earner, but I am still capable of making my own decisions. My boss does not have the right to, well, he does have the right to fire me, but he won't. This is what allows someone to be a citizen. In the Black press, they also make the argument that if you're going to be a citizen, if you're going to have the responsibility and the rights that come with citizenship, that you have to demonstrate responsibility and contributions to the community. But Black people can't serve in the militia. And they can't actually be on those road crews in New York either. They can pay taxes, but a lot of the things that are sort of that. So what happens is that in the Black press, you see a lot of African-American arguments of, we are contributing to the community and to the society, economically, socially, culturally, and so we are still those little r Republicans, and we are a important part of this society. They also remind everybody you have to demonstrate an intellectual and economic capacity to be a good citizen. And then they talk about spiritual and physical equality, and that they are physically and spiritually also ready, just like all those white people. Which brings me to an important point here. What is often overlooked in the story of expanded suffrage and democratization for poor white men is that it came alongside disfranchisement for African Americans and pretty much anybody who didn't fit in this white male column during this period. Many of these changes emerged in state constitutional conventions in the 1820s through 50s, which had a lot of really raucous debates about the nature of citizenship, humanity, the place of African Americans in the Republic. This is where I'm getting all that discourse about what is citizenship, and how I know that it was really complicated and contested. So this brings us to the question of, like, well, what disqualifies somebody from being a citizen? And in some ways, this is very straightforward. Dependence, right? The inability to make good, strong decisions because you're not well educated enough. You're dependent on other people. This is the argument why ladies can't vote, because husbands. But also, there's an argument of spiritual inequality. If you are spiritually inferior, morally inferior, you can't vote. You can't be a citizen. You're not equal. Or physical inequality. Physically, biologically, you're just never going to measure up. You just can't make those kinds of decisions. You don't get the right to vote. You don't get the rights of citizenship or the responsibilities of citizenship. So what I'm saying here is that arguments about political virtue and religious and physical inferiority work together to fuel this wave of disfranchisement for black men in the 1820s through 40s, based not only on the ideas of independence and republicanism, but also based on the belief that Africans are less human than people of European descent. Which means that to advocate for full and equal citizenship, African Americans had to make a clear case also for their full and equal humanity. For black activists, there are several ways to respond to these challenges, some of which I've already mentioned. Scholars have noted that African American leaders made strong cases for civic roles of black heads of household and the economic and social contributions they made to the community. There's a lot of literature also on the idea of racial uplift. This was a pretty conservative approach to the debate that some argue allowed white elites to set the parameters of respectability and citizenship, but arguing that African Americans needed to earn their citizenship by demonstrating their intelligence, their devotion to Christianity, their commitment to traditional American lifestyles, moral, social improvement. All of this stuff does also show up in African American newspapers in the 19th century, with regular columns written for the youth, reminding them to do these things, and also plenty of advertisements for schools, used bookstores, and literary societies. But these arguments about political responsibility and moral and social uplift were mere distractions from the more insidious attack on black citizenship, the questioning of Africans' physical and spiritual equality. In other words, by indicating that black men were not fully human, or were an inferior type of human, white supremacists, some of whom were actually even advocating for the end of slavery, made a case for denying African American citizenship rights. Which brings me to part 2. Relying on theological and scientific racism, many white policymakers in the North and the South argued that those of African descent might not be fully human, much less capable of shouldering the burdens of being a citizen. As much as it was defined by democratization, the 19th century was also marked by an increasing use of science and the Bible to justify the inequality and even non-humanness of non-white Americans. So I'm going to dig into this a little bit by talking about what I'm going to call theological racism. In the 19th century, there were multiple ways to claim that Christianity supported not just the enslavement of Africans, but also permanent inequality, even for those who were emancipated. If you're really interested in this, there is a vast literature of guys like James Henry Hammond explaining to you how the Bible supports them. I can point you to them later, but I'm going to spare you for right now. I'm just going to hit you with some of the major avenues of this argument. For example, the curse of Ham was the argument that those of African descent were descended from Ham, who was the son of Noah in the story in Genesis in the Bible. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but basically Ham got into trouble with his dad and he cursed him and said that for the rest of eternity, basically, Ham and all of his descendants would be servants of his brothers and all of their descendants. And so this argument was then made, oh, well, Africans are clearly the descendants of Ham, and so they're just spiritually, this is their rightful place. By the way, this argument was made about all sorts of different kinds of people who were enslaved throughout history before it was made about African Americans, but that's a whole other subject. So that was one argument. Another argument was that the patriarchs of the faith, guys like Abraham, the father of the faith, the founder of the Israelites, had enslaved foreigners in the book of Genesis and had purchased those enslaved people. Thus, this was acceptable in the Bible, that people who are foreigners, it's okay. You can enslave them. And in fact, Abraham, you'll remember, if for those of you who know about Christianity, Abraham is the founder of the Israelites. He is one of the founding fathers of Christianity, sort of. He's also celebrated because he circumcises all the guys in his family, including all those people that he had enslaved. And so, he was doing them a great blessing, just like those paternalist slave owners in the South have been doing for their enslaved people. And I feel really gross for telling you this. Please understand. So anyway, where am I? Yes, and then there's also St. Paul in the New Testament. God, I'm almost done with the gross Bible bits. St. Paul in the New Testament, there was the claim that St. Paul in the epistles also condoned slavery. First in Ephesians, where he says, slaves, be obedient to your masters. If you keep reading, it also says that masters are supposed to be really nice, but... and then in the book of, I'm going to mispronounce this, Philemon. Yes. Philemon, which is a letter from St. Paul to a really rich guy named Philemon who had some enslaved people in his household, one of whom had run away, and Paul returned him, which gets used a lot to defend the Fugitive Slave Act. So what I'm saying is there were these people who were making these cases about the Bible supporting slavery and also supporting the idea of there are some people who are just, they're inferior and they're supposed to be inferior. Now, don't get me wrong, lots of theological racist literature would also note that masters were supposed to treat their enslaved people with care as Christians. But there seem to be some significant discrepancies there, as the black press regularly noted. Articles pointing out that white newspapers were full of ads looking for enslaved folks who had run away from their Christian masters could be seen in lots of papers, including New York's Freedom's Journal in 1827 and the Alien American in Cleveland in 1853. So, and they did make a big thing about this, of like, really, tell me more about how Christian you are. Of course, that's not the only way editors and authors addressed theological racism. Aside from reminding readers of the harrowing tales of told in slave narratives, editors of black newspapers generally approached the issue with an eye to demonstrating that African Americans, free or enslaved, were actually better Christians than the white people who were using the Bible against them. Now, those of you who've read Frederick Douglass's autobiography might actually really recognize this particular trope of pointing out what bad Christians white supremacists are. This comes up, this is a commonly used trope. In many cases, editors would publish extracts or editorial essays with competing scriptural references. For example, they might say, oh, I see you pointed out that Abraham had enslaved people, but do you also know that Isaac told his sons that one of them would be enslaved to the other one? Is that okay? So they would point to different sections of the Bible. But what was even more common was to incorporate references to the Golden Rule or to the central themes of the gospel: love your neighbor, love God, care for the downtrodden, into essays and articles that actually described things that weren't necessarily religious in tone, like politics and local events. In each of these approaches, it was common to use sarcasm and hyperbole to demonstrate the absurdity of theological racism. In papers like The National Reformer, which actually quotes Acts in its masthead, God hath made of one blood all the nations of men for to dwell on the earth. Yeah, I wish he'd used the NIV too. Editors invoked the words of theological racists themselves to draw them as extreme and foolish, words that were usually used to describe African Americans by white politicians. For example, in a review of a lecture by Horace Mann in Frederick Douglass's paper in 1855, the editor said of the promoters of the Fugitive Slave Act that they, quote, take the very body of Christ himself and cast away such parts as displease them, fitting it for a southern market. In that market, his most precious truths are contraband. Christ cannot get a hearing there unless he submits to a sort of spiritual Missouri Compromise. Noting the weakness of their use of the New Testament, Douglass mocked their attempts to use the Old Testament, saying, not finding support for slavery in the New Testament, its defenders turned to the Old. Now, it's a significant fact that one of the most important events in the early history of the world was the grand achievement of that first practical abolitionist, Moses, who ran off 2 million of slaves in a single trip. And this goes on a little while, and then he's like, we should have Moses on the Underground Railroad. I just love the sarcasm, but also the like, you really want to go here with me in the Bible? In an even more sarcastic tone, a guy who simply writes as a colored American offered a defense of Pharaoh, also sticking with the Moses theme, in Freedom's Journal in 1827. This was actually a reprint from the New York Observer, so editors they were also sort of selectively choosing from all sorts of places to make these arguments. This author demonstrated the absurdity of the 19th century defenses of slavery by placing them in the mouth of one defending Pharaoh's refusal to free the enslaved Israelites in the book of Exodus. So arguments included, surely the Hebrews are not ready to go into the wilderness. They can't take care of themselves. Or, it's not Pharaoh's fault these people were enslaved. He inherited them and now he's responsible for their care. Or, Pharaoh's not totally opposed to freeing the slaves. He just doesn't believe in doing it all at once because, there would be chaos and disruption and possibly violence. Or, my favorite, he might very possibly have thought that it was wrong at first to enslave the Hebrew. He was not to blame for it. That was done long before he was born. But then he found them in slavery and he held them as property. That the whole habits of the Egyptians was such now that the evil of slavery was a necessary evil. Regardless of how many of these, this also went on a bit, the readers at the end of this are reminded that those who are true Christians would confess that the general truth is plain. God hates oppression. And it ends with, yet I say Egyptian slavery was not as hard as some other cases of slavery, and Pharaoh's excuses are, I think, better than what have satisfied and now satisfy many. So again, this, by portraying the arguments of theological racism as absurd and unchristian, the black press promoted a particular narrative about the moral and therefore civic capacity of African Americans and encouraged pride within the community, and really argued for, listen, we're better Christians than blue skies. So now I'm going to totally switch topics. Everybody hold on. And we're going to move to the topic of science. Now, this is going to bring me to my one slide with some racist imagery, and I just want to warn you now that it's coming, so you can look away. I don't really like this picture either, but I'm not advocating this image, but I think it's instructive that we see them sometimes to understand what black editors and writers are dealing with, and sometimes a visual can kind of help us better picture what is being talked about. So now that I've prepared you thoroughly, here I have some examples of the kind of scientific images and literature that were being used by policymakers, ministers, all sorts of people in the white press to argue that African Americans are physically inferior. These two journals, one of them is a phrenology journal, which argues that, some of you are giggling, you know about phrenology, like that the shape and structure of the skull can tell you a lot about the quality of the person, and these were often used to make very racist arguments about the inferiority of African Americans. The other one is a medical journal from the 1850s making this argument that, okay, this is really gross, that those African American enslaved folks who run away, there's something like medically wrong with them. They should like slavery. But don't worry, the cure is easy. It's hard work and physical punishment. These are real. And then there's this one, which is explaining sort of how polygenesis would work, that different groups of humans came from different origins. Where am I? That is not where I wanted to be. In the 19th century, many white Americans believed that people of African descent were physically inferior. This was not just a cultural or religious argument. They believed that it was scientifically proven. A wide array of scientific thinkers, naturalists, comparative anatomists, phrenologists, physicians, all sorts of people, as well as politicians and religious leaders in the first half of the 19th century, popularized scientific ideas like physiognomy, phrenology, polygenesis, ethnology, comparative anatomy, and medical racism to support some variation of the following argument: that the races of humanity come from different biological origins. Contrary to the idea that everybody is descended from Adam and Eve, as it says in the Bible, that particularly in polygenesis, for example, the argument was that Africans, Caucasians, Native Americans, and Asians came from unique biological stock, and that these separate creations of humans were not equal. And you can see this very visually demonstrated in this image from Knott and Glidden's Types of Mankind. And this image is actually originally taken from Louis Agassiz, who was a very well-known naturalist in France. So putting it in here was supposed to make this look more authoritative. Okay, that's enough of that image. So while theologians and naturalists might have quibbled among themselves about the details of which animals different people were descended from, the concept of scientific racism permeated popular culture in the 1830s and had become an accepted scientific truth and an effective political tool for legalized white supremacy in the United States as the 19th century went on. In essence, they argued it would not be necessary to grant full and equal citizenship to a group of people you believed were not fully or equally human. So basically, the black press doesn't just have to present an argument about the fitness of black Americans for the rights and responsibilities of citizenship in a republic. They first have to establish the shared humanity of Africans themselves. Much as they used hyperbole and sarcasm in conjunction with closely related texts and Enlightenment reasoning to defang theological racism, writers and editors of Black newspapers offered a variety of articles and essays meant to demonstrate the absurdity of scientific racism as a basis to reassert their own rights to citizenship as equal human beings. Black newspapers offered their readers the expertise of Black and white scientists to undermine the arguments of scientific racism, much like they did with the Bible. For this purpose, many called upon James McCune Smith. He was very popular. McCune Smith was one of the nation's few Black physicians. He was apparently Edinburgh trained, and a regular correspondent to several newspapers in the mid-19th century. And to support McCune Smith, editors also included essays and reviewed speeches from white naturalists. For example, Frederick Douglass's paper excerpted sections of the German naturalist Friedrich Tiedemannin's 1836 Royal Society presentation on the Negro brain in 1855. Much like McCune Smith, Tiedemannin challenged the work of polygenesis and phrenology by questioning the methods these scientists were using, and also turning to an older scientific theory known as environmentalism, which claimed that human variety was the result of climatic difference, but was not innate, nor was it unchangeable, and it did not indicate separate origins or biological inferiority. So basically the argument was Northern Europeans are fair because they live in dark, cold places. People who live closer to the equator are darker because it's warmer and sunnier. Now, the interesting thing about this argument is that argument of environmentalism had fallen out of favor in the scientific community in the 19th century. It had been much more widely respected in the 18th century, but the Black press prolonged its relevance within the American popular and political culture by making it part of their discourse of humanity and citizenship in the 19th century. And I just learned this morning from one of our MA students that environmentalism became central to some of the political debates over emancipation in the 1860s. So I really want to thank Erica for telling me about that this morning. So it kind of, environmentalism gets a second life because African Americans are using this. But sarcasm and hyperbole also buttress the Black press discourse about scientific racism and citizenship. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to give you my last example. Everybody take a breath. I'm going to give you my last example for today, which comes from an article entitled "The Benefits of Slavery." From, I hope you can tell from the title that this is going to be sarcastic. And it appeared in the Colored American in 1838. They were, in this article, the editor was responding to a recent piece in the Richmond Whig that was calling for a medical college to be built there to compete with Philadelphia's. The Richmond Whig had argued that Richmond would be a better site for a medical school because, unlike Philadelphia, which always lacked for anatomical specimens, quote, because there were so few Blacks employed in servile labors in Philadelphia, and white laborers, when reduced by want and disease to a state of dependence, are nursed and provided for in sickness, death, and burial by beneficent societies. But in Richmond, where the labor of the city is performed by African Americans, quote, there cannot be a want of proper subjects for dissection and the practical instruction of the students. As you can imagine, the Colored American editor just couldn't help but bite at this one. They immediately turned to sarcasm and hyperbole and said things like, so stupid and brutish have we been all our lives long that till this very day it never occurred to us that slaves could be made eminently useful after death as well as before it. But then he went on to sort of point out how absurd this was based on the arguments Southerners were making themselves. And he says, I have just two questions. One, if the slave is not a man, as many slaveholders contend, why not use some other animals, such as horses or oxen, of which we have goodly numbers at the North for anatomy subjects, instead of the colored animal in question? Or, second question, if the slave be a man, why not treat him as a man made in the image of God while both alive and dead? By the way, that's how they ended the article. I just loved how they were like, "You're an idiot." Thus, black newspapers reminded their readers again of the absurdity and inhumanity of those advocating for slavery and disfranchisement based on scientific racism. So this is going to bring me to my conclusion. What have we learned and why do we care? As we wrap up, you might be wondering what to do with all these loosely connected little vignettes that I've shared with you. Some days I feel the same way. You might, I have tried to share a few stories, examples of black activists and intellectuals making the case, or cases, for their rights and citizenship based on their full and equal humanity. But what is the real significance of this? I would say, while it might make a room of mostly white people like ourselves, give us a chance to pat ourselves on the back and say, hey, black people knew what they were talking back then. Let's actually say that there's a really much better reason to be studying this, and that is that, more importantly, these stories help to remind us of how dynamic the black intellectual and political culture was in the 19th century. They allow us to pull back the curtain on one of the ways in which African American communities built their own shared vocabulary for debating the best ways to pursue citizenship, equality, and even emancipation. These conversations were important for African American discourse, but they also impacted the larger political discourse of citizenship in the 19th century, as described by authors like Christopher Bonner in Remaking the Republic. At the end of the day, black editors were clear about their intended audience. They advocated for black school children, literary societies, church leaders, tradesmen. Everybody should subscribe to our newspapers. And if you're not subscribing, you should have somebody else read it to you. They believed that what they were doing was really informing the whole black community. But the fact is that some scholars can point out that actually the audience wasn't exclusively black. Some scholars have estimated that as many as half of the subscribers for Freedom's Journal and The Colored American were white anti-slavery activists. Editorials and events covered in black papers were also reported on in white papers, sometimes resulting in debates across political and color lines in certain cities. The variety of arguments in black papers made their way into the speeches and writings of black activists and white Northern policymakers. And black definitions of slavery and humanity would become the basis for much larger debates as the 19th century goes on, about the nature of citizenship in the United States. Birthright citizenship, national or federal citizenship, were both central to African American debates about disfranchisement and other infringements on their rights as citizens. And these ideas have become central to the American debate and concept of US citizenship since. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for being here, and I look forward to hearing all of your questions, comments, and delightful diatribes.
Thank you, Lily. In keeping with tradition, we'll take our first question in the audience from one of our students.
Yeah, I'm curious, you mentioned there were also white supremacists that were abolitionists that were going with to justify that position as well. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
So I would be hesitant to say they were all, so there were white supremacists who were anti-slavery. I'm not always sure that they would identify as abolitionists. So they would have, it's a lot of hairs to split. But basically, there were people who believed slavery was wrong because it was bad for white people and their souls. And we should free these people. But they didn't see African Americans as equal because they did believe some of this scientific racism or some of this racist theology. Does that answer your question? And so what you would have, these were the kinds of things that would lead someone to favor perhaps the American colonization society of like, slavery should end, we should free these people, we should not let them stay here. So that was, hopefully that answers your question.
Perfect timing. I was curious about the connection between the arguments that were going on in the press about citizenship with that actual colonization. Because I know that Cornish with Freeman's Journal and with the Colored American was very anti-colonization. Did black editors, I know there's also debate within the black press itself, did they use this as sort of a claim to citizenship as the leaders there? How did that sort of play into this?
I'm so glad you asked that because that was the part I cut out.
Let's go.
Yes! I was like, this is too long. Yeah, from the very beginning, this is a question that is sort of at the heart of the conversation. So for example, in the case of Freedom's Journal, which is which is the first African-American newspaper in the United States, there are two editors at the beginning. I think this is what you're hinting at. There's John Russwurm, who's really smart. Like, he's 27 and is now editor of this newspaper. He's a college graduate. He's really thin. He was born in Jamaica. And then there's Samuel Cornish, who I've learned loves to make beef with everybody, who is a Presbyterian minister of the Black Presbyterian Church in New York City. Initially, they're both like, the paper is so like, racial uplift, everybody should be involved in, we should all be getting educated, we should be reading these papers, we gotta build a community. And by 1829, Russwurm is not convinced that citizenship is possible in America. That Cornish is like, listen, we just have to work harder, be better, and the white people will figure it out that we deserve citizenship. The more they get used to us, the more they'll figure it out. But Russwurm, he's like, I don't know, man. I've been around these white people. I don't think it's happening. And the paper folds in 1829 shortly after Russwurm leaves to go to Liberia. Because he accepts this, I guess, great job as the director of education in Liberia for the ACS. So from the get-go, there is a debate about like, what is citizenship and how much of it should we advocate for? There's another moment later in the 1840s where this is they do less of this in the paper itself, although you're absolutely right. The Colored American comes out super anti-colonizationist, and white newspapers write all about how like they're gonna lose all their readers. And Cornish, who is the editor of that one too, goes, I don't care. I am here for the black people. We don't want this. So there's that. But even later, in 1847, at a national colored convention, one of the representatives, whose name is escaping me right now, proposes a resolution that says, like, resolved, being born in the United States entitles you to citizenship, regardless of color. And the majority of the convention, this National Colored Convention, votes it down, including Frederick Douglass. Because they're worried that saying something that baldly, they're really funny, they've got this two-pronged argument. One, well, isn't that obvious? Do we really need a resolution? And two, if we say it too baldly, we will lose the support of those people who support ending slavery but aren't totally on board with equality yet. So those are a couple of examples of what you were saying. Did that answer your question at all?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, hello. So I'm a Europeanist, so I study a lot of scientific sort of literature and innovations in the late 19th century. Everything from technology to applications of alchemy and that sort of thing. Now my question for you is this, but it's actually three-pronged.
Oh.
Okay. So first of all, the stuff that you're studying, and this is just a comment before I start, and is very important even in the early 20th century. Are you familiar with William H. Murray? You know who William H. Murray was? Yes, exactly. And he's very famous not just for being one of the first representatives in the Oklahoma Senate, going to, of course, Washington and being the governor, but he also wrote this book, Adam and Cain, right? Which predates the Ham controversy by going straight back to Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah.
And Cain. Okay, so and meanwhile in America, theologically, there are a lot of these sort of interesting issues regarding who Ham is. The Mormon Church famously once had an interpretation that this didn't apply to black people, but rather homosexuals. So in terms of religion and taking a literal interpretation, this is just really dicey, right? I think that, and this comes to my question, what's so important about your research is that you show how the humanities and a humanistic interpretation of Scripture is vital to overcoming the literalism that many slave holders would adopt and cling to, right? So, and obviously with the great sense of sarcasm and literary references that we have in these newspapers, obviously the humanities are really strong in these African Americans' minds. My question, as far as that's concerned, is that whenever it comes to Moses, right, who is the official founder of Judaism, okay, whenever we see that President Lincoln died, for example, he was shot and killed on Good Friday. Okay, there are many connections made to him and Christ in many newspapers across the United States whenever he's assassinated. But there are just as many, especially from African American pulpits, and also many abolitionists that connect him with Moses as the great liberator who could not live to see the promised land, right?
Yes.
So my question to you is this. You've talked a lot about how whites were using this, Bible and the 66 books or whatever the Protestant American Bible has in it, right? To justify slavery, right?
Mhm.
So how are these African American newspapers consulting with whites who are abolitionists who do want to get rid of slavery by using the Bible, or
Ooh.
using theological arguments?
Um,
I have more questions. Maybe I should talk to you later.
Okay, that'd be great. So Exodus is like very, very, very important to the Black church and to the anti-slavery movement. So yes, one of the things that I think even John Brown at one point describes himself as Moses, that this is that's the big go-to, is to go exactly as you say to the story of Moses, to the story of Exodus, which is also like one of the, it's kind of the like creation narrative of Judaism. It's central to understanding the Bible. Like, to skip it is kind of weird, which is something that these black authors keep saying, is like, hey, you can't just skip Exodus. So those tend to be the sections that they point to. They also point specifically to the Gospels and to the Golden Rule and to Christ all the times that Christ cares for people that are not that are not Hebrew or that are not part of the well-to-do or the kinds of people who would have been considered unclean. And they're like, listen, you can proof text all these other places, but the central theme here of Christianity is love your neighbor and take care of the downtrodden. And so those are the two biggest places that they would turn to.
I have another question about the Seneca Falls Convention and women, but we'll maybe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I had a question. I just wanted to invite you to reflect a bit more on how you've been, because thinking about, you're midway through the project, right? So what you want like readers and audiences to come away from this with, because one of the ways that, like you set it up during the talk, you're like, well, now I'm going to change direction with science. But actually, they're really quite similar in the 19th century, right? That there isn't that much of a difference between theological racism and scientific racism. And like you invited us to, even at the end, that to consider, like, rather than distancing ourselves, like as we can always do, frankly, in our relationship to history, that, oh, thank goodness that's over, that continues.
Yeah.
And as do theological anti-racism and scientific, like, anti-racism, right? So that hasn't diminished. Mm-hmm. So, like, is that a problem that you're trying to work out here? And then another one, and this is like a more specific question about the nature of publics during this period is really striking from what you present, that, we would presume a black readership only, right, from what you lay out. Mm-hmm. But there's a white readership attentively paying attention to what's going on in the black press. Mm-hmm. And they understand themselves to be both a counter-public and yet simultaneously speaking to a white public. And that is a constitutive relationship, again, that continues today, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder, like, is that also a problem here? And even like the 19th century is it's a long time, but the specific period that you're dealing with is also interesting, right? Where things haven't taken the shape that they later take. Mm-hmm. And so there's a kind of experimentation that feels possible. And, places that thinking is going that then don't, the terminus we know where that goes, but something feels more possible in this moment, a different kind of thinking. So I just wanted to really hear about where you're imagining this taking you as the project develops.
Oh my gosh, I just want to like record all of that and write it down. Like, these are exactly the questions that I have been like, I can't answer all of these in this talk, but it is sort of like I've gotten to the halfway point, and those are exactly the questions I'm asking myself of like, how far does this go? How far will I go? Because I think you're right. Like even the stuff that's happening in the 1820s through 50s has long legs. Right? It goes way past what's going on. These things get cited, and I actually did wrestle quite a lot with the question of the audience, because I think that the editors, not all of them, but many of the editors of these papers consider their white audience a secondary audience, and state baldly that, for example, Samuel Cornish is pretty like, I don't care if you white people stop reading, which he does care because it goes broke a couple of times. But I think that's I do actually wrestle with that, because I think you're absolutely right that this is not an exclusively African American space, and it's hard to like, I'm not sure that there are a lot of exclusively African American spaces that we have documents for. So this is, I've been wrestling with that particular question, and I don't have a good answer, but I'm so glad you brought it up. And all of all the things about sort of the uncertainty and the like, this is on the cusp of something that could be one way or could be another way. That is exactly why I love this topic and why I don't have the answers. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Marcus had his hand up.
I'll ask the opposite end of that question.
Oh, great! I'm going to stand over here because the things in my eye.
With the age of revolutions, many of these discourses begin long before the 19th century.
They do.
They begin with the scientific revolution. They begin with the Enlightenment. They begin with the classical liberalism of the 18th century, as you mentioned in passing at the beginning of this talk. So in that same vein as Merve raises, what might you say is the actual contribution here that this second book may bring up at this halfway point? And the reason why I raise that question is twofold, right? The first is directly, like, what are you thinking in that regard? But then secondly, this field, and this is why I avoided my own publishing, it's so historiographically saturated.
I know.
That I can see a lane for a really, really strong historiographical synthesis work here, particularly with your phase of career, right? Where it's time for us to say, okay, let's expand what we're talking about here, and let's make the 19th century more than just these moments that Samuel Cornish and others live in, on the one hand. On the other hand, you revisit and point our attention to these intricacies of theological racism that I don't think we fully know yet. And so therein lies the rub, I think, as someone who is now reading manuscripts and trying to figure out how to say intelligent things. So what would you say?
Man, I love that question. It scares me. That's a good one.
I'm not a blind reader in this.
Funny thing about that, I actually come to this topic as a historian of religion and of popular science. And so at first, I have just been like, wow, there's this whole historiography I should have known about that I'm just like in love with and embarrassed that I didn't know. And I think that is true, that one of the things I'm trying to do is marry these existing discourses, historical literatures of, like religion, science, and the black press and the political culture and citizenship. I feel like we've all been talking past each other, and it would be nice to talk to sort of put that all together. I actually agree with Merve that I think that I was originally just going to stick to the scientific racism part, but as I did, I was like, no, this is all still very, very religious. And I don't think we do enough of that together, and I want to be clear about, like, actually this stuff, you can't really do, they're intertwined and you can't do them separately. Where I add to the already saturated historiography, I am not sure yet. But what attracted me to this topic was that it was a topic that, as a scholar of popular science and science in the early 19th century and also religion in the 19th century, I didn't actually find a lot of Black voices in. And so that was why I was drawn to this topic. But now I'm getting further and further into the scholarship of Black intellectuals and politics, and I'm realizing that it's there, but it's sort of over here and over there and over there. And so I'm trying to figure out where I fit exactly. I don't have a perfect answer, which is why you don't have a book proposal from me. Did that answer your question?
Yes, and I'm hoping that by raising that question also that it's generative more than it is.
No, it's super helpful, actually. Thank you.
Thanks, Lily. So I have a question about, so in the talk, you sort of, the way that you articulate Black articulations of citizenship, at least among these sort of journalists and editors, seems to be really shaped by the reputation of these pro-slavery apologists in the South. In other words, their ideas of citizenship grew out of this resistance or challenge to white supremacy and racist ideas. But you said a few things that make me wonder if it's not a little bit more complicated. And that is when you said that a lot of these Black editors are sort of entreating their readers, I guess most African American readers, to go out and join literary societies or form literary societies, become educated. And it made me think of de Tocqueville's famous description of United States society. He says it's a nation of joiners, right? There's something about the associative nature of American society that defines democratic citizenship. So I wonder if this idea of citizenship that's being put forward in a lot of these newspaper columns isn't broader, isn't a plea to sort of demonstrate the associative capacity of Black communities in the same way that maybe white Americans are, as de Tocqueville showed us in the 1830s.
I would agree. Yes, I actually think I was really worried that I had that in the effort to make this more accessible and clear and cut some things that were just me randomly explaining things that seemed really esoteric, I had wanted to talk a little more. I felt like the talk came out with a lot of more of it sounding like these are just reactions to nasty things white people say, but it's actually, I think that they're also interested in creating a community and encouraging the Black community to create the kinds of institutions and the kinds of educational and religious organizations that give all those white people a run for their money. But not just to give the white people a run for their money, but because this is what it looks like to live in a republic. And in fact, I didn't include this, but one of the scholars of Black newspapers, whose name is escaping me right now, mentioned, I think actually it was Van Goss, mentioned that sometimes to do this, African American authors would then sort of declare that they were more entitled to citizenship than these dirty immigrants like the Irish, because what do they know about how to live in a voluntary society, and they're not joiners, they're not as educated as we are, they're not even Protestant, and so that is also a piece of that conversation. I think actually I would agree wholeheartedly with what you said.
Yeah, no, I'm just suggesting, I think there's a proactive rather than.
Yeah, that's my, I was like, I think this came out more reactive than I wanted it to, and I didn't know how to, once it was written.
You know, and that there's a piece here of performing democracy, I think, that these editors and journalists are picking up on, that is very much separate and divorced from pro-slavery and white racist ideas.
I agree. Thank you.
Other questions?
Just building off of Chris's point a little bit and sort of thinking about, since you said that as you've gone into this project, the concept of citizenship has kind of risen into prominence. How does the, at least, constitutional achievement of citizenship after the Civil War, if not necessarily in practice, does it shift these discourses in a meaningful way? I know that sort of the preponderance of your research has been focused on the antebellum period, but I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
So I'm going to ask you to ask me that again in March. Because I don't feel confident that I've read enough of those later newspapers to say, which was why I decided to focus this paper on the first half. I am going to assume yes, but I don't know for sure. Because I'm at the halfway point and I didn't get there yet. But that is one of my next questions.
I only sort of bring it up because it certainly becomes central to the argument that, oh, they didn't deserve citizenship because look at the failure
Exactly.
to civilize, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's sort of a counter discourse to that as well in the Black press.
I'm gonna hope so. Stay tuned. Thank you for asking.
I was just gonna suggest maybe if you're interested in more modern Black like magazine or newspaper, that you could also look into Jet magazine and everything because they also talk about pluralism as well. As far as like
Thank you. Those are fantastic sources.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a self-serving question.
Oh, I love those.
So you kind of got into a part of research that I've wanted to get into, which is obviously the Black press talking about the medical school and what they're doing and pointing out the hypocrisy of it, which is like making sure that obviously does not get resolved for a long time. So I was curious, you had the example about the Richmond school, but I was interested if you've come across anything else where they're pointing out the hypocrisy related to dissection and the lack of humanity, and also is there any like call to action, like is the Black press proposing or sending out any messages to people what to do, or are they just more saying like this is going on, this is happening?
I'm gonna be honest, that was my only example of that particular argument. So I don't know that there's a big call for within the press, but I admittedly wasn't looking for it. So I don't know.
I don't either. So
If you find it though,
you'll be the first to know.
sweet.
Any final questions?
Oh, come on, you can still stump me more.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Santoro.
Thank you guys so much.